McInnis, Program Manager with One Voice. We want to thank everyone that registered and is able to join us. I know we have a lot going on with COVID-19 impacting our work and our families. Perhaps we can take this hour as a little rest from the coronavirus and try to focus on some important future work that we all will be doing soon. Today, we will be discussing what is happening right now with the gathering of the data from the 2020 census that will be used next year for redistricting. But first, we all have to get through Tuesday, November the 3rd. Before I introduce our fabulous presenters today, I have a few logistic items. First, we have a schedule of 1 hour for this session with a few minutes of Q&A. If you have questions, can you please put them in the chat box, and we will try to answer as many as possible as time allows. So let's get started. Our first panelist is Ms. Kyra Roby. Kyra is a native of Madison, Mississippi. She received her high school diploma from Madison Central High School. She received her Bachelor's of Arts degree from the University of Mississippi Crawford Institute and the University of Child Advocacy and the Innocent Project Clinic. After graduating from law school, Carroll served 2 years as an Equal Justice AmeriCorps legal fellow, working to remove barriers for employment for people with arrest and conviction histories through expungement and other means. She later worked as a staff attorney at the MacArthur Justice Center in New Orleans, Louisiana, where her work focus was on criminal justice reform and various other civic and human rights cases. Previously, she worked as a partner census specialist in the U.S. Census Bureau. Kyra is currently a policy analyst at the One Voice. She is a member of the Word of Life Church in Flowood, Mississippi, and she is a devoted mother to her son, Jack Roby. Next, we'll have Mr. Fred McBride. Fred has been involved with voting rights for over 20 years. The focus of his work is mainly quantity and quality research in redistricting and voting rights law in practice. Fred is currently the Redistricting and Voting Rights Policy Specialist at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law. He has served as senior member at various voting rights organizations, drawn and evaluated redistricting plans, served as an expert witness, and presented at redistricting hearings for over 100 years in the 23 states in the District of Columbia. He has a PhD in political science from Clark Atlanta University with an undergrad and grad political science. He is an Austin lawyer who specializes in employment, civil rights, and public interest law. Bledsoe served as Austin branch president from 1987 to 1991 and has served on the National Board of Directors since 2003. He currently is the chair of the Housing Committee and the vice chair of the Environmental and Criminal Justice Subcommittee and the Legal Committee for mishandling of minority youth and led to the widespread charges and how police abuse cases are handled. The landmark lawsuit resulted in the creation of scholarship programs for college-bound minority youth. Bledsoe also negotiated an African American student scholarship program with HEB, which provides $25,000 in scholarship for students attending Texas Southern University, Fairview A&M, and Houston Texan University. Bledsoe Legal has earned him Law of the Year awards for the Travis County Bar Association and the Attorney General Office, and inclusion in Who's among American law. Bledsoe has led the NAACP and redistricting fight since 2001, and under his leadership, the NAACP helped attain the creation of Congressional District 9, now held by former Houston NAACP President, Congressman Alexander Green. Bledsoe is one of the lawyers as in the recent fight against discrimination and voter identification. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you our presenters. As we get started, each presenter will highlight their work and tell a little bit, maybe a little bit more about themselves. And with that, we'll get started with Ms. Kyra Roby, and let the ladies go first.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you so much for having me today. It's interesting to talk about the census now at this point. My work with the census began in 2018, as Monica mentioned. I served as a partnership specialist for 2 years with the Census Bureau, and so my work focused mainly on community engagement, about engaging elected officials, business leaders, community leaders around the work of the census and trying to build support for encouragement of census responses. I would like to note that One Voice's participation in the 2020 census work actually predated me. And so One Voice jumped in early with the work. I would also like to mention or talk a little bit about the strength of the partnership that One Voice provided to the census work in Mississippi. As I mentioned, One Voice began working on the 2020 census with a previous partnership specialist, Phaedra Robinson, and the work kind of continued through me. The strength of the partnership with One Voice and its support around the census in Mississippi was really, really critical. I tell them all the time, I don't think that Mississippi's response rate would be as high as it is without One Voice's participation. The strength of the partnership included two things primarily. One was the community engagement part, so the grassroots effort and the work and relationships that One Voice already had in the community. And so as a Census Bureau staff person, we were able to utilize their existing network to just bring the census into what they were already doing. And so as One Voice was out talking about voting and elections, we could talk about the census. As One Voice was out talking about education, we could talk about the census. As One Voice was out talking about criminal justice reform and all of these other things and civic engagement, there was always a spot for us to talk about the census. And so it was always timely and it was always meaningful and impactful, even prior to the beginning of the actual count. And so that was one of the unique things about the partnership between One Voice and the Census Bureau. The other thing I like to note is just the fact that the Census Bureau, the One Voice actually utilized some of the census materials in terms of the time frame. And so when at the beginning of our work, when we were just trying to educate people about the 2020 census, One Voice was there and was able to plug us in again to some of the community events that they were already having, just to get people, build the groundwork to get people educated about what the census was and about what and why that was important to them. So by the time that we actually came around to raising awareness that the 2020 census was coming, and when the count actually began, there was a nice groundwork or framework for the census in communities already. And especially due to the COVID-19 pandemic when it hit, that prior work was essential. And so a lot of the success of the census in Mississippi was due to One Voice and community organizations like it. When we're talking about the census in general, 2020 census, of course, there were successes to it and there were challenges. The biggest thing, of course, that we were watching was the actual response rates. And so Mississippi actually finished behind what it did in 2010. I can't say that that's not due to all of our efforts and all of our work. We talk about it all the time. We felt like we did about as much as we could do in Mississippi around the census in terms of getting the word out and encouraging people to respond. But there were some challenges. I like to just mention some of the response rates. So we primarily focus on the self-response rate in the state. Nationally, the self-response rate ended at 67%, and Mississippi ended at 60.4%, which was behind the 2010 numbers of 61.3%. Some of our top 5 responding counties was DeSoto, Madison, Rankin, Jackson County, and Tate County. Our lowest 5 responding counties was Wilkinson, Issaquena, Tallahatchie, Franklin, and Jasper counties. So our highest self-responding county was at 73.2%, and our lowest responding county was at 32%. So that was a wide range. The response rates by cities, I think, fared a little bit better. We looked at that some of the cities, particularly in the Delta, which was, again, where a lot of our focus was, they actually fared better in the 2020 census than they did in 2010. So we did have some successes with the response rate, even though the overall numbers were lower than what we wanted it to be. we got off to a really good start, I have to say, and just kind of bringing the conversation around. We actually started off, we were first in terms of the self-response rates within the Atlanta region, which comprised of 7 states in the deep southeast corner of the United States. And so for several months, Mississippi had the highest response rate. Then COVID hit, and things just kind of bottomed out from there. As you all know, the actual responses were set to begin, the questionnaires were scheduled to be mailed out on March 12th, and I think COVID hit, or everything shut down on March 15th or March 18th. So as soon as the initial questionnaires were sent, we were shut down due to COVID. And so the virtual aspects of how the work ended up having to shift in terms of us getting out of the community, that really hurt state like Mississippi, where you have problems with access to internet. I think our internet response rates end up being the lowest in the nation. And so virtual engagement just didn't work in Mississippi. And so we were able to rebound a little bit the last few months of the census, but overall, that's kind of where the outlook looked in terms of response rates. And looking ahead, I just note that there's still some confusion around what's next with the census. As you all know, again, the deadline for completing the 2020 census changed several times. So the original deadline was scheduled for responses was scheduled for July 31st of 2020. Apportionment counts were scheduled to be delivered to the President of the United States by December 31st, and then redistricting counts were scheduled to be released to the state in 2021. Once COVID hit, the schedules changed, and so the actual count was scheduled to end in October 31st, and the apportionment counts and redistricting counts were scheduled to be released later in 2021. In late September or in early August, a decision was made to not extend the deadline, actually bring it up until September 30th. And so there was a lot of scrambling amongst communities to try to get as many people counted as possible. Due to a court order, the Census Bureau was ordered to actually extend the deadline again. And so they said that they would comply with the deadline, and then we heard that they were going to just extend it to October 5th. And then I think the court said again that that was not sufficient, and the Census Bureau allowed its workers to continue, but then ultimately ended up stopping the count on October 15th. And so a lot of that confusion brings questions into about what's next. And I know the other presenters will probably talk about that, but when we're talking about that, we're talking about not only not having a full and accurate count in terms of the time frame for people to respond to the census, given the pandemic, but also time was cut short for the analyzation of data. And so in the earlier extension, when the data to the president for apportionment reasons was scheduled to be released in 2021, is now going to be released in December of 2020. And we're not quite sure about apportionment counts, but they'll be released sometime in 2021. But that time frame that's shortened for the Census Bureau to analyze all of the data and release it to the president, and then to get the redistricting counts, I'm sure I would suspect that there will be more litigation around that issue, and not just around the population count and the time frame for that. But again, I imagine that our presenters will talk about that, but that's something definitely to keep in mind, especially because we know the work that One Voice and NAACP does in terms of redistricting. I also mentioned another issue regarding a citizenship issue. So at the beginning of the census, there was an issue there was questions surrounding there being a citizenship question on the census. And so there was ultimately not, again, due to a court order, but now there is also litigation around the president wanting to divide or to take out citizenship or non-citizen counts from the actual total apportionment count. So even when the census responses or the results would be released to the president, we don't really know at this time how we'll see that. We'll see the full population count, or if we'll see a population count for apportionment reasons that excludes non-citizens. And so that's something to look at as well. But that's 2020 census in a nutshell. I know we'll have questions and a time for questions and answers. So I'll talk about some of the other issues most likely in answering those questions. So I'll stop there for now.
And as we put tie these knots together, why the census is so important, and as we know what's coming up next. And we know that both of the gentlemen that's on this panel know exactly what we're looking at and what the challenges are. And with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Fred to give a little bit more.
Thank you, Monica. And thank you, One Voice, for allowing me to discuss redistricting and other issues with you today. Good afternoon. My name is Fred McBride. I'm the Redistricting and Voting Rights Policy Specialist at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law. I am pleased to be a panelist today. I'm a native Mississippian. I haven't been home in a while, and so I will take this as a virtual visit back to my native state. And so I welcome this opportunity. The Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights was founded in 1963 at the request of John F. Kennedy to enlist the private bar's resources and leadership to combat racial discrimination and resulting inequality of opportunity, things that still exist today in 2020. What I will discuss today mainly involves redistricting, as redistricting is my primary specialty and has been for over 20 years. But it's impossible to discuss redistricting without also talking about voter mobilization and the census. So I'm going to tie them all up and then end with more of a discussion of redistricting in the time that I have, because we can't draw fair districts without accurate census data. And in drawing fair districts, we want to present people, minority groups that have been disfranchised for years, for decades, the opportunity, granting them, the purpose of redistricting is granting groups the opportunity to meaningfully elect candidates of choice. So it's impossible to talk about redistricting without talking about the census. And it's impossible to talk about redistricting without talking about a fair process for you to go to the polls next Tuesday and cast a fair vote that will be counted. You have to discuss all three. And in that voter mobilization piece, next Tuesday is important, as mentioned earlier, but I want to express to you that the first Tuesday in November next year in 2021 is important too. But I dare ask you, do you know the races that'll be on the ballot in off election years? Because next year, I will express to you, is as important as this year. I know it's not a president on the ballot, and I know you won't see House members unless it's special elections, and Senate and all of that next year, but you might want to pay attention.
See if he come back. Okay, I think Fred might have froze. And with that being said, I know Fred talked about earlier that when he came on, that Mississippi is his hometown, and he gonna take this as his visit to home. I want to take this moment as the next panelist come on, Mr. Bledsoe. Over the last probably 15 years, I saw him yearly at the NAACP National Convention, and this I guess this will serve as my visiting with the Texas University, Texas State Conference NAACP, and getting a chance to see President Bledsoe of the NAACP State Convention in Texas. With that being said, we know that you have a lot of years of experience, a lot of fight in you, and a lot of fight left in you. We was just talking recently about yesterday. We learned that polling place in Madison County moved about 2,500 of their African American minorities out of a precinct into an put them in an all black precinct. So we know, those ballots and things when it comes to the challenges that is happening. And I know like you worked hard on the Shelby versus Holden. So I'm gonna turn it over to you and let you give a little bit about yourself and the fight that you have had on the battlefield fighting for us.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm just always love being in Mississippi. I just hate that I'm not there today because I always love being there. I can't top Fred and saying that I hail from Mississippi, but I can say when the news came out about the 110-year-old African American female who voted for President Obama back in 2008, that was my cousin. So at least I can say that. So. But let me say that I think you guys are really focusing on the important issues. I wanted to have a backdrop to my presentation to actually lay out what I think is actually going on right now, because I think it's important for us to understand that. I think everyone probably does, but I want to mention it anyway, and that is. There is a feeling in this country that African Americans, Latinos, and other minorities cannot be entrusted with the welfare of this country. But due to demographic changes, the country is changing from being a predominantly white country to being a predominantly minority country. And when you look at white allies who sympathize with the vast majority of minorities, you probably have 60% of the United States population. But there are power bases that have been in control of the country for so many years, at least in partial control, that don't want to allow these types of changes to be made for a number of reasons. So what's at foot is something that I call how to make 40 greater than 60. How to make 40 greater than 60. That's really what this whole undercount issue is about with the census. Because what does it do? We talk about the goods and services of the monies that come from the federal government back to the states, and the need to fully show your population in the census in order to get the proper revenue back to your states. But a conscious decision has been made that political power is much more important. So what I see is a movement afoot to redistribute power in several ways. By manufacturing a census undercount, you can change the dynamic in the United States Congress, and you can change the dynamics, the electoral dynamics. We talk about now, we're looking at the news every day, and they're saying these are the red states, and they're going to go to President Trump, and these are the blue states, they're going to go to the Vice President Biden, and the purple states. But that, Trump has a difficult road to 270 because of the numbers of electoral votes in the different states. What this will potentially do is change that dynamic. Okay. So what the idea is to infuse and to give a greater population strength to like rural states or states of that nature. So you can change that dynamic and change the dynamic in Congress in several ways. Not only do you change the dynamic in terms of the representation from states, but you'll change the dynamics in terms of the representation within states. And so I think that's really what's afoot here, making 40 greater than 60. And related to that, is a Supreme Court opinion from a couple of years ago that we all need to take note of. It came out of Texas. It's the Evanwell versus Abbott opinion. And in the Evanwell opinion, it ended up going the right way, but the language of the opinion was somewhat problematic in the sense that it upheld Texas electoral districts that were based on the census, because it said Texas had the discretion to choose whatever database that it would choose to use in redistricting, but the state had discretion. So the state would have discretion to choose another one if it desired to do so. So we look at Evanwell, and Evanwell is like a roadmap. Okay, Evanwell now allows states to use different databases. So you can use the census for determining the number of congressional seats, but then when you get down to actually doing the redistricting, you may choose a different database. Specifically mentioned were the eligible voters, whether you should use eligible voters. And I know we've already had, you had Kyra talking about earlier the whole issue with immigration or what have you. There's going to be that issue there as well, the citizenship issue that's going to crop up. So the next interesting question will be, to what extent will they start to try to carve up the population by using different types of databases or different databases than what have been traditionally used in order to draw up lines. And another issue I want to point out that is important to understand going forward is that the other side has been involved in a chess game. And people wonder all the issues in reference to the need to affirm a Supreme Court justice so quickly. Well, it's not just about this specific election. It's not just about Obamacare, though those things are really major parts as well. It's about the long-range plan and the long-range plan to redistribute power in America. Because what we've traditionally done in the past is we've kind of had a certain parameter in which everyone fit, the major players. And so there were things that people were not willing to do on the Republican side or the Democratic side or what have you. There was a certain playing field. President Trump has changed that playing field, okay, to where things are really now outside the playing field. So people are now willing to do more things. And so being able to think that there is a Supreme Court that we can now go to that would actually implement the Constitution and do the things that we should do as a nation is a little bit idealistic. I think Chief Justice Roberts in some instances might be expected, but I think there's a real concern with the other five conservatives about whether or not there can be a check and a balance on a movement to make a minority in control of the United States government is what this is about. So I don't want to take too long, but I know we were supposed to come up with recommendations about different things that might be done to address these issues. So I have several that I want to talk about. One of the ones is that, and I think Vice President Biden kind of talks about it, the campaign trail, and you wonder about a lot of things. There are people out there that hate us more than they love themselves. And that's really an issue and a problem because in many ways, some of their future and their interests for their families are basically the same as ours. All they get is a feeling that they're better than us, but the way the system works, it clamps down on them and their families too. And they need to know that and understand that. And when you make stupid decisions to have undercounts on purpose that will reduce benefits coming to your community, it's the same thing as fighting Obamacare when you're going to negatively impact your communities. We need to somehow be engaged in outreach with these groups to diminish the power of the people that seek to oppress us. I think that's one issue. A Another issue is we need to have the Supreme Court reform that people have talked about. Now, whether this means changing the numbers of the court or some other kinds of authorities or delineations, we need to have that, because I think what's occurred here is you put the Supreme Court on a path to really start to vindicate the rights of the extreme conservatives, who are a clear minority in this country, in order to repress others. You know, I know Justice Jackson once said that, you know, we don't live in a pure democracy, because if we did, the majority would run roughshod over the minority. And so the idea here is to put Black folk, brown folk, Asian folk in their places, and be able to hold them in check. That's really what this is about. So we're going to, and because the Supreme Court is so important, Supreme Court reforms, I heard where Vice President Biden talked about appointing a commission. I think that's going to be important, but we need to weigh in and talk about what kinds of changes need to be made, because it may be more than just changing the size of the court. Now, another thing that we need to understand is that sometimes when people use these kind of mechanisms, they may backfire. In Texas, this last time, we had situations where you were packing all these minorities into districts that people felt wouldn't vote. The lower voting African-American districts, and you had even much lower voting Latino communities. And they were packed into congressional seats that were expected to be safe Republican seats. And two of those seats were won by Democratic insurgents that shocked everyone, because they weren't even to be marginal seats that are to be contested. But because of how they draw things up, when you use false numbers, you got to put people somewhere. So as long as you get people registered to vote and get them out to vote, you can actually make a change. So we need to be looking at that as well. In fact, in one of them, we had an African-American congressman to win in a white Republican congressional district, Congressman Allred. So, you know, with two seats where the packing backfired on how they did it. So we need to be looking at that as another alternative as well. Another alternative is, to the extent we can get folks out to vote. You know, this is going to be one of the most crucial elections, and who's going to be sitting there when you decide what database to use in redistricting. But besides that, we have to understand that the Supreme Courts of our states are another option, because what I've said so far is very clear that those of us who live in states that have been red, and that we don't have an avenue in our highest courts. But to the extent one can influence those things, we may be able to circumvent the United States Supreme Court by litigating in our state court system. But I will say this, which is a concern. Kavanaugh's opinion the other day, and in the Wisconsin matter, is really kind of great concern, because he seems to take the authority away from the states to make independent decisions about election matters that occur within, and give those to the United States Supreme Court. So that's pretty frightening there. But I do think we need to start looking at our state courts as another option. And and we also need to look at adjusting numbers, right? Because I think one of the things Kyra mentioned earlier, and we need to understand the significance of it. Normally, the numbers get reported in January. The numbers reported to the states around January 25th. But by reporting the numbers in December, that gives President Trump the authority to report the numbers, and takes that authority away from a President Biden, if President Biden is elected. So the question becomes, if President Biden's elected, does he have authority between January 20th and January 25th to communicate or change or adjust those numbers would be a real issue. So we're going to have to really look at those numbers, because what I see is that there's been a clear effort, and it's by design, to actually manipulate the system and the actual numbers that exist there. But it's all about the 435 in the Congress and about getting 270 in the Electoral College and the presidential elections that are really behind what's actually going on with the census and the census undercount. So I think that's probably my time there. I look forward to questions later. Thank you, guys.
Got a disconnection, and as we get ready to wrap up, then we can take a few questions. We do have a few questions in the box, so I give you a few more minutes, Fred, to finish from earlier.
Okay, thank you, Monica. I don't know what happened earlier. I think I left off discussing the census as a second check, something that we need to do. We need to at least discuss every year. So every 10 years, we're not spending an awful lot of time explaining why it's important for funding and why it's so important for reapportionment. If we do this all the time, then it becomes a second check that people already know about and people are in tune with, so that every 10 years, we just automatically complete this form and fill it out. So that is important. But the census is important because I cannot draw you a fair election plan unless I have good data. I can't have good data unless you fill out your census form. And in filling out that census form, I understand confidentiality and privacy and all of that. The census is confidential. It is private. I know there may be a lot of distrust in the government, but if you want a fair city council district, a fair congressional plan, you've got to fill that form out. We already know about the funding and the money, but you've got to fill that form out such that One Voice, Lawyers Committee, anybody drawing districts can have the actual and true demographics of areas such that we can ensure that fair electoral districts are drawn. Because what is going to happen inevitably in Mississippi, many places in the South, and not necessarily in the South, and it isn't necessarily partisan. Republicans do it, Democrats do it. State legislatures draw these plans, and partisan gerrymandering has been deemed okay by the Supreme Court. So if they can draw districts to maximize partisan interests, the Supreme Court says it's justiciable, but you know what? We don't have a remedy for it. So we come in with the Voting Rights Act, one person, one vote, and equality concerns, communities of interest concerns. We come in with all of this to ensure that we can draw you a fair plan such that you can meaningfully elect candidates of choice. And no one knows your communities better than you do. So if you live in Mississippi's 2nd Congressional District, and you understand the dynamics of that district, and you hear about a plan next year or the year after, where all of a sudden the 2nd Congressional District is going to skew itself to northeastern sections of Mississippi and outside of the traditional boundaries of District 2, and the lines look odd or strange, you know something is going on. And you have to act, because we're going to act, but we can't act without your participation. So voter mobilization, census outreach, as well as public education, and public education around redistricting. It's not as popular as when we discuss voting next week or voter suppression and those kinds of things, but it is just as important. Because if that district is drawn such that it doesn't matter who the minority community supports, that person will never win, then that district is not serving the purpose for the people. And that's what we're here for. And I look forward to taking questions in our Q&A section. And thank you all. And I apologize for that interruption. I don't know what happened.
The questions. And since you was just talking about gerrymandering, and we just recently in Mississippi, all the way up until 2019, was still redrawing districts because of gerrymandering. So one of the questions is, Mississippi traditionally gerrymandered districts. What are some of the things that we should look for?
Know the district that you're currently in. And as we're waiting for the census, or know the dynamics of it, I should say. And as we're waiting for the census, you are going to have an opportunity to work with organizations like One Voice and the Lawyers Committee and a lot of other groups, because it's not something you have to sit back and watch. It's something you can participate in. So what you need to be looking out for is that plan that you see in the newspaper, that here's what the legislature wants to do. Pay attention to it. Get on the phone with One Voice. Monica, I'm putting y'all on blasting you here.
Appreciate it. Yes.
Say, hey, there's something odd, because I didn't know this community or this section of Mississippi was even in this congressional district. Is there something going on? And Monica and Sambi and we all are gonna know, because we have the software to look in that district and tell you, yeah, that octopus looking thing that's sent over there took this district from 65% Black voters to 52. And trust me, when that happens, we are all gonna know about it, because there's a reason. And of course the rationale will be, well, the demographics in Mississippi changed. And according to the 2020 census numbers, there aren't a lot of Black people in this district anymore. No, that's not true. I haven't been away from Mississippi that long. I know that a lot of that is not true. I know legislatures will skew lines for partisan interests. So we're going to look out for that. Pay attention to communities, because no one knows your community better than you do. You know if something has branched out and grabbed some people you're not familiar with, you know there could be something nefarious going on. So pay attention to those. And I speak of congressional districts. I'm also talking about your school boards. I'm talking about your city councils. I'm talking about your county commissions. No one knows your communities better than you do. That's why we don't draw plans without community input. I may know Mississippi. I'm more familiar with South Mississippi, but I know that I can get on the phone with Monica and say, hey, we're looking at something in Greenwood. Something looks strange there to me. And you can get on the phone with people people you work with, and they'll tell you, oh yeah, I was at that redistricting hearing and they just didn't want to hear any of our suggestions. Well, that's why we're all here, to participate in these hearings and bring it to their attention, because you don't have to sit back and watch them draw districts. You can participate, learn how to draw them yourselves, and present a redistricting plan.
Thank you so much for that, Red. And that is so true. And then we are getting ready to hit the grounds again, educating and informing people about the redistricting and how they can get involved in those hearings. With that, I'm going to go to the next question. This is for Ms. Kyra. This is, why are African Americans missed so often in the census?
How much time do we have for that one? I will say, I think
just a few minutes.
A part of it, is historical, the origins of the census, without getting, too deep into it, and African Americans not being counted as a full person. I think that's definitely a part of it, the historical nature of it. I think Mr. McBride touched on the distrust of the government. That was we found that pretty much everywhere, to just get across that barrier. I know a lot of times in the meetings that we would have, and Monica, a lot of our conversation had to be centered around confidentiality and privacy concerns that people would have. And so there was a lot of education that went into that. And a lot of times once people got over that hump, they were okay with it. and sometimes it was going into the details about the Census Bureau systems and programs. And then sometimes it was just saying like, hey, you fill out all this other information. Or in some meetings, people would say, government has your information anyway, like you give it to us for this reason. And so, there were, I guess, in different parts of the state, there were different strategies in how we communicated that message, but we had to communicate that everywhere we went. We saw a general lack of uneducation about what the census was, and not only amongst community members, but amongst elected officials. I know as a Census Bureau employee, we spent so much of our time trying to educate elected officials about what the census was, about why it's important, and trying to encourage them to engage in it. I mean, years, literally, and in a lot of places, just trying to get elected officials on board, because once those numbers come back, we knew that they would need them. And we wanted them to understand, what was going on. And so just a general lack of knowledge about what the census was and about why it was important. And particularly minority African American communities was a big deal of what we did too. And then another part of it was just, even once people kind of understood why it was important, there was always a sense of, okay, so how does this affect me? Like, yes, we talk about the federal funding, but does that money really come to me? Or we talked about redistricting, but I think that was just so far off, or people didn't really kind of understand the process, that it wasn't always as impactful. And we talked about apportionment, and that was kind of far off for people too in their minds. And so a lot of times we had to just bring specific examples when we go into communities where there was a consolidated school district. We had to talk about that. When we went into communities who had been recently impacted by a natural disaster and there wasn't enough funding for those particular communities, we had to talk about that. When we talked about voting districts and school districts a lot, and when we talk about money, I mean, Head Start was something that resonated with people, just people on public assistance in general. All of these things kind of compacted in making minority and particularly African American communities undercounted. And I would like to know quickly, just to, in terms of that as well, there was a structural or operational problem within the census operations as well. And now that, I'm kind of on the other side of it, even the operational parts of it doesn't fare well for particularly rural America, which impacted Mississippi. Yeah, and people in rural areas. And so we saw that too with the Census Bureau and how that impacted African American communities. And also with some of the people, generally, when we would get calls about workers in certain areas not being familiar with the community, I think that hurt African American communities as well. And so I think there's a wide range of problems that impacted the count amongst African Americans. But, we tried, and I think, coming out of the 2020 census, that's one of my hopes, is that something that I will count as a success, is that we were able to at least educate a lot of people and bring people more involved in kind of the civic engagement portion of it. And so hopefully we won't have as much trouble in 2030 regarding that.
Thank you, Kyra. And I was on the battlefield with you, and we went around the state of Mississippi. And I appreciate your answer and appreciate your input on the question. My next question I'll go to, as we winding down with our time, to you, Gary. And the question is, what are ways which voter suppression shows up? Is it policy, or practice, or both?
Well, it's both. There are just so many ways that we have voter suppression that we're dealing with now, and I think we need to understand that. I wrote a legal piece about this several months ago, back in April, I guess, because I could see that the COVID-19 pandemic was going to be used as a means of voter suppression. So, and I don't mean to be getting way out there, but it's absolutely true. You fail to address the issue so that you can cause fear to be felt around minority communities who are the biggest victims of COVID-19. And so you have a real concern for the virus that's there, and by not getting it under control and by making sure that it continues to have a disparate impact on racial and ethnic minorities, that can have a chilling effect on people actually going to the polling places. And it's kind of like another bookend to that part is the idea of how you handle matters at the polling places. That's a policy issue as well. If you put in defective machines, if you change it to where you can't do straight ticket voting and you have to go through each particular item in a ballot and check the names out, if you send inadequate numbers of individuals to precincts to handle as election officials the vote, then you're going to cause long lines. So you've got a pandemic, people are afraid, and then you're going to have long lines where they're going to be next to people for extended periods of time. And I know in Texas, we're litigating it now. We had a victory this week, but it got stayed. We'll see what happens. But in Texas, they decided not you have to wear a mask if you're out in public, but if you go to vote, you don't have to wear a mask. And so what's happened is that the poll watchers have come in without masks, and they go up and approach and get within the space of black voters, right? And start talking to them when they can't. And so the whole idea is to intimidate black voters. When you have somebody, you don't know if they have the virus or not. You know, I had to shut down a polling place this week in Fort Worth because an election judge ended up testing positive for COVID-19. So clearly that's a matter of policy in terms of how you handle the polls, how you deploy things. You limit the number of sites, you limit the number of days that early voting sites are open. And so that's another policy is how you implement the law in reference to absentee ballots, right? And so that's a matter of policy and practice as well. And so the policy will be to do what you can to make sure that absentee votes are not counted. Whether that means a signature requirement not being met when you have people untrained and analyzing signatures, making a determination that signatures are not the same, or whether that means you have some arbitrary requirement that the votes be received by a certain date. And that's where maybe the other more affirmative action that is also a matter of policy but practice as well, that's with the Postal Service. So back in July, when they started this, they were very smart. And so by the time they decided to pull back in September, they'd done so much damage to the Postal Service that the mail is slow. And they did it in strategic areas. They did it where you find our folks, right? They did it so the mail would be slow. That's clearly voter suppression that's intended to do that. I love President Obama's comment about kneecap the post office, which is what effectively happened. And you know, when they had the head of the Postal Service before Congress, he said, "I will make no more changes," but he didn't agree to back off and reverse some of those other changes. You know, that's where the NAACP and LDF and others have been involved in litigation to try to force them to change some things. But I think one of the things we don't know now, there are going to be a number of absentee ballots that arrive late. That's been the whole discussion before the Supreme Court. And so I guess we know now in Minnesota, they won't be counted. And we do know now that in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, they will be counted subject to a potential review by the Supreme Court. But that even the Supreme Court could become involved in voter suppression if they decide to veto the Supreme Courts of the other states and not allow absentee votes to be counted. Another thing that they do is the ballot counting. There's a process of how you count ballots, right? And we all remember, or maybe some of you guys may be too young, but back in 2000, when we had the situation in Florida, we had the issue with the hanging chads. And so it depends on who's counting ballots, right? And so I think people know and understand, and many come to those with a design. I think we saw, I think I saw an article yesterday when I was surfing for recent voting changes. Found an article where the head of a vote counting board at one of the counties, who was a county judge in one of the major Florida counties, had given substantial money and given money to President Trump on 8 or 9 occasions. And he was the head of the vote counting board, so he ended up having to withdraw from being on that board. But you have people, because what we've seen with poll watchers that have been there, they're out there to actually create a ruckus and to instigate fights and to try to badger minority voters. And so I would believe there are many people who might ostensibly not have that exterior, but who have that interior, that are going to be in those rooms. And I think what you'll find is that in red states, red counties, things like that, the majority of people making decisions on how those votes will be counted will be people that may be hostile to minority votes. And so we have to understand, I've seen minority candidates lose elections because of how they make decisions in those boards and decide not to count a certain number of ballots. So it's not over till it's over. And so that's why we talk about fair count, right? We have to have a fair count. But if you can not count, that becomes a voter suppression. Now, we've also seen around the country the requirement of voter identification. They have voter identifications that minority communities have less or fewer than the white community. There's also even the issue of voter registration and how you register to vote, making it more difficult to register people to vote, and putting requirements in like expiration dates, et cetera, and how long an ID can be expired before you can legitimately use it. And, consciously not using things like government issued IDs, like if you're a state worker or something, that won't do. Or if you happen to be a college student and you go to a public college, and that won't do. So, we have all these kinds of requirements that are being exacted upon the public that are intended to do nothing but suppress minority votes. And the other thing that's really going to be big this time that I haven't mentioned, and we saw this yesterday out in Missouri City in Texas and Houston, you're going to have these large groups of intimidators that are going to be wearing guns. They were carrying AK-47s yesterday. They even had a tank, and there was a rally for Joe Biden, and they decided to go and disrupt the rally for Joe Biden in Missouri City. And they actually attacked the NAACP president from Missouri County who was there. So, we see things like that are probably going to be more. I'm really concerned about Election Day. But I think if you start seeing people that look like they just came from the mountains somewhere, driving around minority neighborhoods in a very intimidating fashion, that's going to be really intimidating. And, we saw the ruling in Michigan, right, about being able to use or wear guns into polling places. And after what just happened there with the governor, you think that's outlandish. But, we have that issue about the use of guns, and those AK-47s that we saw in Missouri City yesterday. I expect we're going to see more of that kind of thing to get that out there to try to prevent us. It's not that far away from the kinds of things that we saw back in the 60s and 50s. I think that whole idea is to let minority voters, and that maybe even the whole idea where you see an email that goes out to Florida voters telling them, putting their full names and their addresses in there to let people know we know you, we know where you are. And that's really intimidating for somebody to get that. So all these are means of voter suppression that are going on, and we need to be concerned about it. But the thing that we need to do is we need to understand that this is about our freedom, because if we don't stand up now, the marginalization of our community is going to be so extreme and so great, it's going to be really hard to dig out. It's going to be like we just returned back to 1855, right before Dred Scott. So we need to understand that. So we really have to just be strong and to hold our chins up and to go forward and to kind of look beyond and don't let these guys intimidate us from doing what we need to do. We need to vote because this election is going to be so important.
Well, thank you so much. And we know here in Mississippi, we already have had a lot that is going on, and I don't even want to imagine, think about, excuse me, this upcoming Tuesday. But I won't be surprised of anything. However, we are coming down to the end. We have just a few more minutes, and I want to allow each one of you 2 minutes to give your final thoughts.
I'll go. My final thoughts are: democracy is about power resting in the people. We've talked about voting. We've talked about the census. We've talked about redistricting. You can participate in all three of them. You don't have to sit back and choose. And it's fundamental. It's a right, and you should exercise it. And I'll end with this. I have a teenage son, and I know teenagers. I was one a long time ago. They like to do the very opposite of what you tell them. I guess it's just the nature of growing up. So if a government doesn't want you to vote, there's a reason behind it. Do them the way you do your parents. Get out and vote, because there's a reason why they don't want you to. And as defiant as you are in your younger years growing up, you should be rushing to the polls simply because they have worked so hard to keep you from it. So participate and be active, and not just this year, every single year.
I would ask everyone to take a look at history and to understand who we are and where we've come from, and understand that the ancestors that we all have that were enslaved endured so much so we could have opportunities. It must have been so incredible for them, many of them who never left enslavement, to stay and endure where they were simply because they had such hope that someday we'd have a better opportunity and that we could be treated much better. So I think we do a disservice and a dishonor to them when we don't vote and we do not participate. So I think we have an affirmative obligation in their honor, in recognition of what they did for us and the sacrifices that they made, that we have to go forward and participate with courage. And I would say that we have to understand that this is an extremely important election. Do you want the whole idea of stop and frisk to become a national plan? Do you want racial profiling to be allowed and permitted? When you hear someone say that putting a housing project in a community ruins your community, where you're just putting a blemish on everybody who lives in a housing project. When you tell people that when you refuse to condemn people that are white supremacists and tell them to stand by, do you all need to understand more? When you look at shootings of African Americans in cold blood on videotape, and people being unable to have compassion for them, and all they say is, we support police. I support police too. I support good police. I'm sure all of you do. We just don't want to see the massacring of our communities by people who don't mean the community well. And so when you understand and look at all those dynamics and understand the lack of dignity that goes along with those kinds of comments and conversations, you realize that there's a lot more, because most of what's being done now is under the cloak of some kind of political scrutiny, where maybe things aren't said as clearly as they're said in the back rooms. And so if you really want to have a future for yourself, your children, and your children's children, you need to understand that this is an extremely important election. It's an extremely important time. This year is 2020. It's not ironic that it's the whole idea about vision. It's going to be extremely important for all of us to roll up our sleeves and get out there. And it doesn't matter who you are, what your plight in life is. If you're not eligible to vote, you can still get other people out to vote. And if you are eligible to vote, you need to make doggone sure that you can vote. And if you know other people who are registered to vote but maybe will not vote, we need you to reach out to each and every one of them. You know, I look back on these final comments back in when David Duke had been nominated to run for governor and was in a runoff with Edwin Edwards in Louisiana. And I looked at my good friend Rupert Richardson, and we helped in the campaign there, but I learned a lot about campaigns there. But, you know, 93% of registered Black folks in Louisiana voted that year. And Louisiana has never been known for having high voter turnouts. But people understood the significance of the consequences of their not voting. And so people got together and reached out to sometimes the voters or anybody who was newly registered who not likely to vote. And so they did something that was truly incredible to turn out 93% of the vote. That's the kind of thing we can do everywhere, but we need to make sure we do that in every other election. You know, one of the things that is happening nationally that we need to understand, that after the election of President Obama in 2008, there was such an outcry in the bigoted community that the most extreme Americans, that 10% of America, those extreme white Americans who don't like us and who hate everything about us, they now vote in every election, not just presidential election. Let me say that. They now vote in every election at a rate of 90% and above. And so they've even skewed Republican primaries, where the most extreme people are likely to win because they voted such high numbers. If other people are voting at a 25, 30, 35% rate, and they're voting at a 90% rate, you can understand how they skew who's on the ballot. So we have to understand they see that. And a lot of this early vote that we see are their people that are voting. It's not just people who are aligned with us. So we need to understand. And the only way we keep this victory that is there, if you look at all the people and how they would vote, is the more people that vote. It's going to be harder to cheat if more people vote. So the more people that vote, it's going to be harder for them to cheat. And so we need to encourage you to get out there and vote and do everything that you can and to have courage and don't be dissuaded in any way.
Good, powerful. Hopefully Mississippi has been voting like none before in this election here. So I'm hoping that everybody is getting in and understanding the significance of and why we should be voting now or much as early as possible, but basically on November 3rd, getting out. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Thank you to this wonderful panel, Kyra, Fred, and Greg, and Gary. I know we will cross paths soon. This not only for the next decade, but this several other behind this. We have a lot of work to do and a lot before us. I'd like to thank One Voice Executive Director, Deshaun McBride, and all the hard work in moving Mississippi forward and keeping the Mississippi Black Summit going for over 13 years now. We would like to thank our sponsors. And if you like this session and would like to see future virtual sessions, send us an email our topic, and we would like to see what you would like to hear. We can make that happen. And remember to make history on Tuesday by going to the polls. And One Voice has a nonpartisan election protection program that we partner with the Lawyers Committee, and we seek to ensure that every eligible voter casts a ballot and that ballot is counted. We are the only organization in the state of Mississippi that has an election protection hotline, and that number is 888-601-VOTE. That's 888-601-8683. So once again, I want to thank you all. And if you want to stick around, there's some more panels behind this. We have a criminal justice panel. We have a health and high water panel and follow the money panel. But most of all, if you need some relaxation, there is a Black party tonight at 6 o'clock. Please join us. And once again, thank you and good evening.